Heidegger's thinking often seems pervaded with a sense of the poesis or making of things is not um, sufficient because it's a theoretical picture. Um, Originally, the theorist was somebody who, who went somewhere and looked at a display about the thing in the sense that today, if you go to Delhi or to some city in India, um, you'll see on the streets, say even between streets on the islands, you'll see people with shrines to various deities. And if you go look, then you can find out something about uh, what that deity is all about. So, for instance, at the beginning of the Polity, or what we call the Republic, um, Socrates has just come back from looking at a display of a Thracian goddess called Bendis, which is supposedly corresponds to the um, a Greek goddess, which is you see Heidegger talk about this a little bit, and not about the whole thing, but about the importance of Artemis, the butcher goddess of the forest. The forest is important for Heidegger. But in any case, looking at things theoretically means that we don't, for Heidegger, um, in direct terms, that the question of the essence of the thing isn't asked adequately in this sense. Is if we're um, talking, so let's move directly into the subject matter I want to get to, is that AI, um, uh, what's going on with the AI situation. And so then let's look at somebody who was involved in it. So we have figures like von Neumann, or Neumann, um, who were good at doing calculations, right? So it said um, at age 6, von Neumann could divide 8-figure figures one from the other. So as though that were something spectacular, although actually it's not. On the face of it, it's not impressive at all. So why is it not impressive? Because one, almost anyone, even the lowest capacities among us, can do that. So 20 million divided by 10 million is 2. So 10 goes into 20 million twice. But okay, so then you think maybe it's the bigger figures. But it's something anybody can actually teach themselves. Most anybody can teach themselves to do. So if you think of something like these bricks, and you look at, so what I'm trying to show is to myself and to others how stupid and simple a lot of these things are. All arithmetical functions are just based, they're all based on the same thing, just having one thing like a brick, and then say you had 50 bricks, and you say how many times can one, well, let's say how many times can 25 bricks go into 50, and then you're just superimposing the 25 on that 50, and you see, oh, it goes in twice. You can place them right. Just think about placing 25 bricks directly over the 50 bricks. You only cover half. Do it again. That's all. All arithmetic is the same. It's all based on the. It can all be reduced to the most simple function. So then, this is why when we have computers that are very complicated, this is why people. When they talk about artificial intelligence back in the 50s, when these things were more obvious to people because there wasn't that much distance between doing computations in the head and what the physical machinery could do, people like Turing said the question of whether a machine can be intelligent is too stupid to be posed. So you can make a question of whether you can fool somebody or whether a machine can sort of do the same fill the same function superficially as somebody, but basically, a machine is so far as a machine is something which an engineer devises a way to make arithmetical functions and then functions that are more complex, but ultimately based on arithmetical or geometric functions through algebra based on geometric functions. They're simply totally unthinking automatons. So Eric Schmidt at Apple has recently been talking about this automation issue, this so-called eruption of automaticity. So, and I think he has in mind the ability of the machine to duplicate human tasks, but it would be only superficial and outward duplication. So the first thing I want to say to start, and so to see how the theoretical view, this view of looking at something from outside, in that context, it's just like looking at the bricks. We're just looking at a machine, as it were, which we can also, when we do computations in our head, like that 20 million divided by 10 million. Wow, it's eight figures long, but it's very simple. It's only two, right? So when we do that, then we see that the same thing that can happen, as it were, within the human being could also be easily engineered. In some cases, not so easily engineered, but can be turned into physical, independent objects. But does that mean that that the human being is being replicated there? I would say the simplest way to look at this is to say almost everything we hear about AI can be divided in two ways. So I would use the metaphor of this discussion with Tucker Carlson and Elon Musk, where Elon Musk says totally correctly, he says there's, Tucker Carlson is talking about, oh, do we need to be prepared to bomb the machine? So it's kind of like he's thinking of a Skynet issue, the Terminator issue. But Musk says, no, we just unplug it. That's all you have to do is unplug it, because there's absolutely no danger of the machine coming alive or something. This is sheer superstition. So it's better, it's not even superstition, it's just fantasy. So it's not really worth going into. It's sheer fantasy. The only subject in the human world that's worth fantasizing about is probably death, because we can't comprehend it. But other than that, usually fantasy is just a waste of time, right? So we could make a division between the bombing, the necessity to bomb the thing, and the unplugging version. I think on the unplugging side, what's the real question? It's whether human beings have made a tool that they find useful. So then when we talk about things like social terraforming or whatever, what Leo Strauss already in the 60s was calling super brainwashing. So if you have a super brainwashing machine, somebody wants that machine to exist, right? It's not like the machine has come alive and it's protecting itself because it's a sentient being or something. No, it's somebody likes that machine, and maybe it's Conrad Zeus or something, a businessman. Maybe it's Eric Schmidt himself, businessman. Maybe it's some politicians or something. Maybe, so we have already, I think of the film, there's this figure, Rotving, a sort of semi-vestigial sorcerer figure who's sort of like halfway between the sorcerer and mad scientist in the 1927 film by Fritz Lang, right? So there's this notion of which we could make almost clearer by going back to Goethe and his Sorcerer's Apprentice. So the sorcerer, we could say, is this utterly this utterly primary and potential power, and he goes away. So and then the apprentice comes in and he says, oh, the sorcerer is gone. So now I can play around with some of his spells. And then he animates a broom, and it starts mopping, and the water starts gushing. He thinks this is getting out of control. He tries to stop it, etc., etc. I think here the real question is not that the broom becomes a goblin and something evil, and then the sorcerer has to come back and stop it. So you can see this is really sort of a metaphor for it's another way of dealing with the theme of God is tot, so God is dead. God is gone. Will God come back? Can only a God rescue us, as Heidegger says. But it's not. It's misleading in a way, in the sense that it's not that the machine would somehow do this Deus ex machina thing, or that it would somehow become sentient, or this sort of almost mystical things that you get about the how does Kurzweil, how does Kurzweil put it, this infinity point, I forget how that's called, where everything would just get away from us. But it's really that you can see that this is the power. It's just a power put in the hand of human beings. I think that's the biggest way to look at it. Now, I wanted to, just to give a quick take on, this is my understanding of Nietzsche. So I'll just put it that way. I'll try to put things that way more going forward. It's almost always impossible to say this is the this is what Nietzsche says, because he said so many things, and Karl Jaspers wrote a book and said Nietzsche said everything in the reverse, so it's almost like a biblical interpretation. It's very difficult, but it seems to me one can adequately show Nietzsche in connection to Western thought as a whole by bringing him into contact with Aquinas, and then Aquinas brings us into direct contact with what we're just talking about simple arithmetical and geometrical operations that any human being can do, but which at some level can easily be taken up by clever engineers, even much less clever than von Neumann, so Conrad Zuse, and people like this who are not really talented in higher thinking, but knew how to do things on a practical, direct level. We have this statement in Aquinas that God, he limits his own absolutely dominant power by his own intellect. So this so-called potentia ordinata. So the ordinata is that, I give a specific example of it, that he says that triangles, two right angles, God cannot make two right angles that you don't sum to the total of the angles of any triangle. So even God, as it were, by his own will, limited himself to this order, to this mathematical order in that sense. So this is where, there was already a theological dispute about this, where he said, well, but why should God not have this absolute potential? Why should God limit himself in that way? Who was this? Right after Thomas, I think Occam came out with something on the, maybe I'm getting that mixed up, but I think Occam came out with this argument in favor of the potentia absoluta, but you can easily look that up, potentia absoluta and potentia ordinata. But so one can see Nietzsche yeah, if you look at Nietzsche properly, then you have to think about Schelling, and Schelling's already talking about the will and how it's in the specific terms of German idealism. But we could also think about it just in the terms of the most direct, simple way is, um, yeah, we have something that sits before us. So say um, um, the von Neumann architecture for a computer, and then we set our will towards that. We want it. Yeah. Um, and this setting the will towards something um, can go on the higher level where the will can be set to absolutely um, stick with mathematical thinking, which links up to poiesis and making in Heidegger, which links up to technique, or it can go away from that. And then it's not just an arbitrary choice here, but there's a lot of um, considerations which have to be shown in some detail that they're real and that we don't go off into fantasy. But basically, Nietzsche says this simple sense of this yay or nay saying, the will of putting yourself in the direction of something, clearly it can't be subsumed in a kind of Darwinian picture, because we have the possibility to set ourselves towards suicide, to set ourselves towards, which is always viewed as something negative in the West by a long prejudice. But of course, one can see in other, in tribal cultures, often suicide is almost is nothing. It's like they just, somebody wants to leap off a cliff, kill themselves. It's not, they don't have the whole pent up notion of their identity is at stake, and that they're a precious being, and et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes there's totally different attitudes towards that. But the very existence of that we can use our will to kill ourselves shows that the will can't be subordinated to the idea of survival of the fittest, or to some natural force that is totally beyond us. We have direct evidence through this ability to commit suicide that the will can simply be brought out of that whole circuit of survival and so on. But then you could say, maybe if the will were, or sorga, or pain, which we try to avoid. So Voltaire has said there's no such thing as happiness, because happiness is a fantasy, but pain is real. So that then we see this kind of utilitarian thinking coming in. But so far as the will doesn't need to be turned towards things that build things like mathematics, like we're just going through, but is open. So as soon as you say the will is open, and also that it doesn't have to necessarily go towards something which has been deemed in advance as rational, so such as mathematics, mathematicos, which originally didn't just mean math, but it meant any knowledge which was deemed to be eternal. So anything that was in the mind of God's ordinata was mathematicos. If you sort of interpret the medieval Catholic view back over the classical Greek view, that's how it looks like what mathematicos must have meant. Yeah, if we went into it in detail, we could show, passages in Plato and so on to give more exactness to it. But in any case, the idea to will to power is very simple in that sense. Yeah, will simply does not have to long for and want each villa. I have the will. It doesn't have to have the will towards one true good thing. It's open. So that's basically all will to power means. That's the main thrust of it. It's totally open. So then the openness, though, however, always seems to be towards viewed in this, what Heidegger's called the Vorhandenheit, or the present to hand, which is like it's always this. There's an object, not necessarily an external object. So we just showed that when you're doing calculations in the mind, however simple or however complex, you have something before you which you can will towards or will against, which you can yay say or nay say to. So in that super simple sense, there's you can see that this question of object and subject is not necessarily, or it's not limited to something external to us, like the bricks, but it also goes to things that we can have before our mind, which nonetheless we can obviously through engineering link to machines, which then lead to problems. But ultimately this, so I just ended by saying again, it's so simple. It's just that the need to bomb the computer banks is fantasy, but the realization that somebody who wants those machines, whatever they do, whether they do some kind of super brainwashing, as Leo Strauss already said in the 60s, if you're worried about this, why don't you just stop? But it's because there's already people. Harold Oswell was already kind of worried about this, but Harold Oswell was sort of had that 50s, everything is swell kind of view, where it's like, okay, we can use the robots to do good things, and we still kind of have, in a more extremely subtle way, this view, and like Eric Schmidt, as I was saying, in this automaticity as, okay, now the computers can, or robots can be, or neural nets or whatever, can be made to mimic us in our tasks and then take over those tasks for us, which was in a way already basically what Marx and Engels were thinking about. Like, as soon as we get enough, they were thinking in terms of industrial machinery, but as soon as we get enough machinery, and they had the example of the machinery in the agricultural revolutions, how much, which is true, like we had used to be like 70% of people had to be working at farming. Now it's like, I don't know, less than 10%, 5% or something. And then if you had computers, it would be none. So these tasks leave human beings open to, in the stupid, Engels Marx version, to paint in the morning and raise cattle in the evening for amusement or whatever. But to do anything, right? To be open. So this open, all that goes to the going away of the absolutely dominant and potential force of the ordinata, and the coming in of this just openness of the decision of the will to point towards this way or that way is what's I think this is what there was already much greater awareness, and you already see it in like I just said, in Goethe's Sorcerer's Apprentice poem, and so on. You already see this theme in a keener awareness in the Prussian sphere, but the talk of things like military-industrial complex and so on show why it's not so easy to go away from that. And let me just say one more thing, is that it's impossible. You can't say Heidegger has made a mistake, as some theorists are saying. There's somebody called Bates at UC Berkeley was saying, Heidegger has made a mistake because he doesn't see that poiesis and making and technology go all the way into the human core of the human being and the brain and so on, and neural plasticity and so on and so forth, and that there's nothing else. But of course Heidegger has already said that. That's why he talks about the technological essence. But what he's saying is there's a subtle presence issue where we're always talking about something that we've made an object, and made an object of yay or nay saying, so both inwardly and both the brick and in our thinking. And this is what he's saying, that's presence, but then there's also this other category of the Zuhanden or the ready hand, which means when we're involved in things, we don't have that theoretical background. And then when you try to adjust to that and see what it means, it opens up a different kind of possibility of investigation.